Hello everyone, welcome to the weekly DeSmogCAST, where we clear the PR pollution that clouds climate science and shed a light on some of the biggest environmental stories of the past week. I'm your host, Farron Cousins, DeSmog blog contributor, and joining me this week we have Carol Linnitt, Managing Editor and Director of Research for DeSmog Canada, Emit Gilchrist, Executive Director of DeSmog Canada, and Kyla Mandel, the Deputy Editor of DeSmog UK. Let's kick things off this week with you, Emma. I know one of the biggest talking points that we've had basically to kind of derail the entire clean energy, clean environment movement is that, you know, these are things that are bad for the environment. We've got some new studies up there in Canada that show that that's not exactly the case. Tell us what's going on up there.
Yeah, so a really interesting new study this week from a group called Clean Energy Canada, and what they did was they looked at the progression of the clean energy industry in Canada over the last 5 years. And what they found was that jobs have increased by 37% during that time. Over $24 billion has been invested in clean energy in Canada during that time. And perhaps the most interesting takeaway from that report is that there are actually now more direct jobs in clean energy than in the oil sands. So that's a really interesting high-level look at what's going on in terms of clean energy in Canada. Meantime, we've had an interesting scenario playing out in British Columbia, kind of a particular instance of this energy environment debate, and that's over the Site C hydro dam. Now, hydro, you know, people used to think of that as a clean energy solution. It's no longer really thought of as a renewable, low-carbon solution because drowning massive amounts of agricultural land results in methane released into the atmosphere. So it's not really seen as a clean solution anymore. There's been a lot of controversy over this proposed Site C dam in British Columbia. And last week, a report came out from the Canadian Geothermal Association. Now, geothermal is an energy that's used commercially to create electricity around the world. Canada is the only country on the Pacific Rim of Fire that isn't using geothermal energy. And this report basically states that there's enough geothermal potential in British Columbia to more than replace the energy of Site C dam, actually for half of the cost, and with more jobs created in the process. So that was a really interesting report, although to be honest, the knowledge about geothermal potential in Canada is not all that new. 30 years ago, the Site C dam was on the table, and a panel then said no to the project and told the BC government to investigate, guess what, geothermal energy. Now, the Energy Minister of BC is still saying, no, BC doesn't have the ability at this stage to go forward with geothermal energy. So it's kind of the same old politicians not getting briefed properly on clean energy solutions that are viable around the world.
Either not getting briefed or just choosing to remain ignorant on the issue. It's a lot of what we see in the U.S. And also what we see in the U.S. is that these talking points of how, you know, in these investments in renewable energies or these investments in safety standards, they're going to cost us jobs, they're going to cost us money. You know, study after study has come out proving this wrong, and yet we do have a lot of the public that really does buy into that, at least here in the United States. Carol, quick follow-up. Do you see the same kind of success with those talking points up in Canada?
Yeah, absolutely. A good example is the conversation surrounding carbon tax. So these market mechanisms that could be deployed now at early stages in order to facilitate this transition to cleaner sources of energy. The carbon tax in Canada by the Conservative government was called a scheme, and the job killing carbon tax was how they officially referred to it. So definitely a sense of fear as if there's no economic security to be had in a move to renewable and clean sources of energy. But as Emma pointed out with this new report, the clean energy sector is growing despite those challenges.
And Carol, keeping with you, but moving on here, oil sands have kind of been trumped up as, they're going to be slightly cleaner than traditional oil and gas methods. But what we found out through studies over the years is that obviously over their lifetime, much, much dirtier. And now DeSmog Canada had reported earlier in this week about these tailing ponds with the oil sands. Give us a little insight into that. First of all, for people who may not be familiar, can I tell us what these tailing ponds are and what we've found now about the toxins coming out of them?
Sure. So the tailings ponds are basically the reservoirs for the waste that happens, through the extraction and refining process, where they basically have to wash out oil from this mixture of oil and sand called bitumen, which is what they mine in the oil sands. And so over the years, these tailings ponds have just grown and grown and grown. Now we have 176 square kilometers of tailings ponds. And so the new study that we just reported on was a study through Environment Canada, our federal environment department, that showed that the toxins that are being directly emitted from these ponds are almost 5 times higher than ever previously estimated. So I think one of the interesting things about this is the fact that Canada constantly says we have world-class environmental monitoring and world-class standards in place. But by virtue of the fact that this kind of study had never been done before, they'd done sort of mathematical-based modeling. Given the size of the tailings ponds, we think maybe we're emitting about this much pollution. But this research was the first time they'd actually ever gone into the area and used real filters and devices to actually do on-the-ground true measurements. And what they found is that these polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, so petro-based chemicals, are just basically being vented into the atmosphere at an extremely high rate. So it kind of points to this ongoing problem of the tailings ponds and this issue of waste associated with oil sands production, but at the same time this issue of science. Like we are saying that we know what is happening there, but as we get these little peeks behind the curtain, which happens rarely with science in Canada, it's usually not a good news story.
So Emma, now that we have this report that was obviously done by the Canadian government, we know these things are bad. They're bad basically from the time you pull them out of the ground. Doesn't matter what you do with them, if you burn them, if you clean them, if you store them, if you dump them, it's bad. Do you think that this new report is going to maybe spur any kind of federal movement to maybe clean it up, make it better? Do you think the federal government there is going to do anything about this with this new information?
Honestly, I don't see it. We've had a lot of reports like this over the years about the oil sands, and there are also some jurisdictional issues. I couldn't, even if it was the federal government's jurisdiction, I couldn't see them really stepping in on it. However, the tailings ponds are often managed primarily by the Alberta government, and they actually introduced new regulations several years ago to reduce the amount of tailings that oil sands companies are allowed to create. However, at that time, environmentalists kind of hailed these new regulations as a step in the right direction. However, they failed to actually enforce them. They failed to make the companies live up to those regulations to reduce their tailings. And so consistently, although this regulation exists, companies put forward plans and proposals that right in their proposal states that they won't meet the regulation, and the projects are still given approval. So I don't honestly think this report is going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back and makes the Canadian government start managing the oil sands more responsibly.
Well, let's move along here, actually. Speaking of government action, first of all, Kyla, great to have you with us. It's your first time with us. First time we have a representative from DeSmog UK. But as we just said, government action. We've started these climate talks in Lima. Very big UN, world leaders from all over coming here. What do you think we can expect in the next week and a half of these climate talks? I mean, obviously, on a global scale, we have essentially gone years and years and years of having these talks, very little action. So give us the 10,000 foot of what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, there's a lot of pressure, I think, on governments to come out with something from these talks in the lead up to Paris. I think people are saying that they are, mildly optimistic. There seems to be a bit more optimism in the air right now, which then obviously increases the pressure on governments, because you had the US-China pact come out, you had the EU announce their emission targets before the Lima talks, so you have some momentum building up, but obviously there's the challenges. So I think a big thing that's going to be coming out of this, or that's going to be touched upon, is finance. So again, leading up to talks, you had governments pledge money to the Green Climate Fund. So again, you're going to have the wealthy nations versus the developing nations trying to tie over the money. And so you might see wealthier, more developed nations say, well, we can't really commit anymore because we already pledged to the climate fund. And obviously, you know, the UK has their elections coming up in May. The US has elections coming up. Canada has elections coming up. No one's going to want to commit a new government to further financial commitments that they can't foresee. So that's going to be one sticking point. Another one then touching on finance as well is loss and damages, which came out of the Warsaw talks last year. So for developing nations which face a very real existential threat from sea level rise, they, you know, need extra help, perhaps some could argue, and then it might be called compensation, which is obviously a word that people don't like to throw around, I think, sometimes when it comes to these talks. So again, that's going to be another sticking point, trying to see if you can find a middle ground somewhere, what mechanisms will come out of this, building upon what came out of Warsaw last year. And then obviously you'll have the EU's pushing for legally binding targets, whereas the US isn't, because they face putting something through the Senate, which will have a Republican majority, so that's going to be tough as well. And obviously, because the targets or draft that's going to come out of this potentially will be sort of a hodgepodge of different national targets, you're going to have very good mechanisms to review these targets in the lead up to Paris. So where does it put us on the path to 2 degrees, or I suppose, you know, how far off from 2 degrees does it put us? And then also, how will you measure one against the other so that when it comes to Paris, we'll be able to really secure something?
Well, you know, one of the biggest problems that I see with governments, and I see it especially being a U.S. citizen, seeing how we address the issue of climate change, is that for some reason we don't want to lead. When we say we're going to aim for this amount of reductions, like the deal we just had with China, but China is only going to go this high, well, we go this high, we have all this backlash saying, well, why aren't they going as high as we are? And it's because somebody, any country at this point, really somebody needs to come out there, take the lead and say, you know what, you may not be going as you know, setting as high a goal as we are, but we're going to do that. And then we're going to set it even higher after that. Everybody else, come on board and let's get it done. And right now, the biggest problem, I would love to see anybody leave these talks at Lima as a clear leader on this issue. And so far, that's been the biggest problem, is that we have no leaders. Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for this week. Carol, Emma, Kyla, great talking with all of you. Everybody, you can get all of these stories that we talked about, DeSmogBlog.com, DeSmog.ca for DeSmog Canada, and DeSmog.uk for DeSmog UK. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you all next week.